We're going to continue our study, and tonight we're talking about power and providence in our study of the book of Esther. And just to start off with, have you ever found yourself in a position, possibly, or doing a job that you never thought you would do? Well, back when I was in high school, one that when I was in English class, and it was time to recite a poem or I had to give a speech, it was the one sweating bullets. I don't know if you really sweat bullets or not, but that's just a saying that has went around. But I would just get so sick and to my stomach thinking about having to get up in front of people and actually talk. And the worst part about it was reciting things and have to memorize it word for word, because I'm just thankful for notes at times, because I'm really bad with memorization. That's not one of my strong suits. But if you had asked me then and told me that I was preaching all these years later, I probably would have said that you were crazy. But God places us in positions that we feel oftentimes unqualified for. And that's the beauty of people that have flaws in their life, people that are not perfect to accomplish His will. Looking back at it, it's interesting to see how people from various backgrounds came to power. Think about this. In the 1970s, we're all familiar with Jimmy Carter, who was a peanut farmer who became president of the United States. And then a few years later, Ronald Reagan became president, which I believe is arguably one of the best presidents that the nation has ever seen, became the next president. But as you look at these two individuals, they came from two vastly different backgrounds, yet both occupied the same office of being President of the United States. And the Bible tells us it is God who raises people to positions of prominence and allows them to be in power. And we've seen this throughout history. Now, let's get back to our story of what we were talking about last week. The last time we saw and were talking about Esther and Mordecai, God had moved them into key, important positions within this story. Esther as the queen, and Mordecai as an important attendant in the king's court. And even though they may not have understood what was happening around them at the moment, God had all this working behind the scenes. He was working out His purpose and His plan through both of these important characters. Now, tonight we're going to examine how God's providential guidance will allow Esther and Mordecai to have influence over people they would have never have been close to had not God placed them in the current positions. See, God places us in certain situations to accomplish His will and to accomplish His purpose. Oftentimes we can ask, why me, God? Why this situation? But God has all that out. He works out all the details, and it's all to bring Him honor and glory like we know. So first of all tonight, let's look at this, positioning for power. Now here we are introduced to a new character. A new character has walked out onto the stage that the audience is now introduced to, and this character's name is Haman. Now, let's talk about Haman just for a couple minutes here. Haman, first of all, is promoted. Now, since a wicked king was ruling, you have King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, he's ruling. Other wicked individuals are going to try to gain favor with this king. If you got somebody wicked that's ruling and you got someone else with wicked thoughts, it just kind of goes hand in hand together, and something bad is going to come out of this. Now, throughout this story, no one tried harder to gain the king's favor other than Haman. Haman's efforts were successful. He was good at what he was trying to do. And what is that? Be deceitful. He was trying to get his way. And what happened? with him being deceitful and wanting to get his way, the king promoted Haman. Okay? He put him into this position. Now look with me at verses 1 through 2 of Esther chapter number 3. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. I mean, set him up above the princes. I mean, this guy, he just had a sly way of talking. You ever met someone that's just really slick about what they do and how they go about it? And they seem like they can just smooth things over. They can make it seem like it's okay. Everything's going to be all right. I see Haman trying to be like this. He's just a deceitful individual. But verse number 2 says, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Now, let's look at his ancestry. Now, the Bible makes special mention of Haman's ancestry, specifically that he was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. This is relevant to Mordecai, a descendant of King Saul. This is very important because the Agagites were the descendants of King Agag. Agag was king of the Amalekites when God had ordered Saul to destroy the Amalekites. But Saul disobeyed and spared Agag. Now, Haman, a descendant of Agag, hated the Jews. See where this is going? He hated the Jews, and he would soon set his sights on destroying the Jewish nation. Now, we're going to find out later, he didn't want to just destroy them. He wanted to rub their noses in the dirt. He wanted them eliminated. He wanted them completely destroyed. Now, let's not only look at his ancestry, but let's look at his advancement. This is Haman. The text tells us that the king set Haman's seat above all the princes that were with him. Now, this promotion seems, I think, a little bit possibly misdirected. Mordecai saved the king's life. Now, we touched on this last week. What did he get? Nothing. Nada. He didn't get one thing whatsoever by saving the king's life. But he did get to watch this. He got to watch the enemy of his people. Haman the Agagite gained undeserved power. Did he deserve that power? No. But how would it be to watch a man with his self-conceited, just his attitude that he had of wanting to take out the Jewish people, to watch all this take place? It had to bother Mordecai. It had to really just concern him. Ever heard this non-biblical proverb, no good deed goes unpunished? And there's days where that can often feel very true. Very true. Mordecai did good. He did. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. But he got no reward except to see his enemy promoted. You know, it's oftentimes in the world I get asked the question, why does it seem like this old world, it seems like the bad prospers, but the good just doesn't really go anywhere? Well, you know why that happens is because we live in a broken world. We live in a world that has been a mess ever since the sin in the Garden of Eden. It's been a mess. It has. But here we see that Haman manipulated the king. Remember, he's sly. He's very much a sly individual, is trying to get his way, and he manipulates the king through bribery. Now, we're not going to read verses 8 through 9 right now because I'm going to talk about this in a little bit as well as we get more into this. But as we look, Haman offered the king 10,000 talents of silver, the equivalent of 375 tons of silver. Now, here in a short while, I'm going to give you the equivalent of what that would be today. I'm going to leave you out there on the diving board, okay? Wonder what we're going to do, all right? Leaving you out there. So some scholars believe the king was in a bad financial position. why was he in a bad financial position at this time? Well, many commentators believe it was due to the failed campaigns that he had against the Greeks. And Haman very well knew about this. And what happens when someone sees a weakness? They jump at it. And he knew what he needed to do to gain the king's favor. He knew what he had to do in order to get the king to side with him. So Haman very well could have known the king's financial woes as the perfect opportunity to get a promotion. And my question would be, how in the world did Haman come up with all this money that he had? I don't know, maybe he deceived a lot of people in his life. Very possibly could have. So we come to this story and then we see something happen. Mordecai refuses to bow. So what happens here in verse number 2? It says, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman. So as Haman walked in, he had this favor that was placed over him by King Xerxes. And now we see that he walks in and everybody's bowing and reverencing him. So you got this guy that's really slick, he's sly, he's deceiving. And he's just probably eating this all up. Oh, I'm telling you what, he's just feeling like he is invincible. And then there was one that would not bow. Good old Mordecai. Mordecai would not bow. Look what it says here once again in verse 2. We'll read through verse number 4. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Mordecai, what you doing? What you doing, man? You got to get on board with this. Bow. Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, Haman tried to bully those around him. Rightly so. He probably could have walked up and said, hey, I'm buddies with Xerxes. And guess what? If you don't bow, you're out or you're dead. And they would have had to have listened, and they would have had to have reverenced. Whether they liked him or not, that wasn't the case. They had to bow and worship. This was a commandment from the king here. But let's first of all look here at Mordecai's disobedience. Why did Mordecai refuse? Now, it's very obvious that this is part of the story. But the Bible doesn't tell us really Mordecai's motive. It's not there specifically about why he didn't bow. But it could be out of obedience to God's law or aversion to Haman as the enemy of Israel. Okay? Or a combination of both. It could be this. Look what it says here in Exodus 20, verse number 5. Maybe Mordecai remembered this. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third, fourth generation of them that hate me. Maybe quite, and this is just a big maybe, a hypothetical here, because we're not told. Maybe Mordecai was very familiar and knew this verse, and maybe it was in the back of his mind, and he knew what God had commanded here. Not to bow down and serve them, because the God of the Jewish people, the Israelites, is a jealous God. But also Mordecai may have believed that bowing to Haman would be a form of worship. Now, he could have possibly have gotten on his knees and faked it just to get out of the situation, but he wasn't going to do that. I believe Mordecai was a man of integrity. And I believe that he was one that was going to do the right thing regardless of the situation. Warren Wiersbe said this: Mordecai's controversy with Haman was not a personal quarrel with a proud and difficult man. It was Mordecai's declaration that he was on God's side in the national struggle between the Jews and the Amalekites. So Mordecai was saying, okay, you're on one side, but guess what? I'm on the side of God. So this is where I stand. So many in Mordecai's position may have done a half-hearted bow just to avoid the consequences, like I mentioned earlier. There may have been some that bowed and worshiped, and they probably thought to themselves, this guy is a clown. He is just a big, sly, deceiving individual. But I'm going to do it just because no one else will criticize me and will say that I didn't do it. You know, that's what happens today with peer pressure. I know we're not teenagers in here. Their teenagers are over there. But oftentimes teenagers will get led into this. When something's been said or a group of friends are doing something they shouldn't do and they're in the midst, what happens? They'll join in and they'll think, I know this is wrong, but I don't want my friends to laugh at me. I don't want to be looked down upon. And they won't stand for the truth. Well, Mordecai wasn't going to just join the crowd just so that he could escape whatever would happen if he chose not to. He stood, and he was not doing that just to avoid the consequences. Mordecai refused because he knew that which was right. But not only do we see Mordecai's disobedience, but let's look at his declaration. Verse 3 and 4 again. When the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, when asked why he would not bow, he simply says that he was a Jew. He wasn't trying to attempt to incite a rebellion. No, we don't see him trying to recruit people, going around saying, don't bow, he's a fake, he's trying to deceive. No, he wasn't going around trying to do that. He just quietly refused to bow. Refused to bow. And for the next several days, I get from this picture in this story that eyes were upon Mordecai. Can you imagine all of them are bowing and Mordecai's up there and everybody's eyes are going, what in the world is that guy doing? You know, what's he doing? And for days, observers wondered if he would bow. Maybe this is something that just in the heat of the moment, he just did it just to be seen as standing out. They thought, later on, Mordecai will bow. And this is what the Bible tells us. That they wondered, they asked, they thought, he'll change his mind. He'll give up. But he didn't. And guess what? When Haman found out and Haman saw what was going on, he was mad. Really mad. You ever talked to someone before and they've been really mad? Whew, boy, I have before. There's been times where back years and years ago, I've sat in an office and somebody just being mad walked in, and it wasn't really per me, it was just someone else. And I thought for a second, whoa. You know, I could just feel the heat just from the anger that they have, but I can't even imagine. Many commentators believe that this anger that he had toward Mordecai was so just horrendous and was so evil within the concept of how mad that he was, that it was if you could even imagine this just for a moment, it was a step past being anger. Is that he wanted blood for him not bowing down to worship. And this created anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism was a problem then, and this has been a problem throughout the history of mankind. This is a hatred, just hatred for Jewish people. Think about this. We're all familiar with this in history. During World War II, 6 million Jews were killed under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. The atrocities of the concentration camps left the world with one of the darkest blots in its world history. Many Jews fled from Europe during this time. Others tried to hide their Jewish identity or change their names. But this was a very dark time. But also during this time here, this was a time in which a man by the name of Haman wanted to eradicate and wanted to wipe the Jewish race out. And this has happened throughout history. Adolf Hitler wanted to do that. And the enemies of God have tried for years to eradicate His chosen people, but they have never truly succeeded. And why is that? Because God has promised His people. He has been good to His chosen people, which is the Jewish nation of Israel. And that's very important for us now historically as well, as we see what's going on with current events, is that Israel has been under attack. And we know what we see on TV, but we must be remembering how that God has always said He will take care. But He will also despise those who fight and hate against Israel. And that's why, like it's been said time and time again, that we support Israel as a nation. And if we ever have a president that fails to do that, shame on America. So we must always keep that in mind. So first of all, we saw the positioning for power. And second, let's look at the plot of Haman. Now Haman wanted vengeance, but that was not enough. He wanted to eradicate all the Jews. Why? Why did he want to eradicate all these people? They weren't the ones who was doing this to him. Mordecai was the one that would not bow. But what it says here in verses 5 through 6. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, here's another quote, and I like this, by Warren Wiersbe. It said, Haman's hatred for Mordecai soon developed into hatred for the whole Jewish race. Haman could have reported Mordecai's crimes to the king, and the king would have imprisoned Mordecai or perhaps had him executed. But that would not have satisfied Haman's lust for revenge. Putting Mordecai to death would not have sufficed him. So here we see Haman's proposal. Haman, as sly as he is, and as deceitful as he is, wasted no time in plotting the Jews' demise. He wasn't slow to act. He was very quick. So perhaps being superstitious, Haman cast pur. Now pur are lots to decide what month to kill the Jews. He was already plotting this out. He said, all right, this is where it's going to happen. So he cast the lots when to do this. Esther 3:7 tells us, in the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Now, casting lots, this is important, casting lots was actually a means that even Israel, believing in God's sovereignty, not luck, used to seek direction from the Lord. So there's a difference here. Haman was looking for luck, but as they cast, it was a matter of seeking sovereignty. Leviticus 16:8 tells us this. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the two goats, one for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. Now, I'm not talking about here that it's okay to gamble, all right? I know we've gotten off topics like that before. But here we see that he was casting lots to see when this should happen. So God overruled in Haman's superstitious casting of lots to extend the date to almost a year away. All right? Then Haman then approaches the king, still being deceitful in his appeal. And we find in verse number 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore is not for the king's profit to suffer them. Now, without naming the Jews, we see this very obviously here. Haman convinced. This just solidifies how just deceiving he was. Haman convinced the king that the people Haman had in mind did not follow the laws of the Persian Empire. This is what he's telling them. He's telling the king, these people do not follow the Persian Empire the way that you want them to live. So he used bribery. Now we get to an important part here, and I'm going to give you the answer to the question I asked you earlier. Esther 3:9. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. This is the plan. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it unto the king's treasuries. Now, John G. Butler, another commentator, said this. Scholars estimate this amount of silver as being close to $4 billion in our money today. It was 375 tons of silver. Herodotus, an ancient historian, said that this amount of money was 2/3 of the entire revenue of the Persian government. So with that being said, how could this king turn away? You know, oftentimes how you get people to do stuff, you say, I don't know if I can do it for that price. Well, I'll give you a little bit more. You know, they start changing their mind when the dollar goes up. So here we see that he gives him this amount of money, and what does he say? He says, let it be written that they may be destroyed, just annihilated. So here's the king's decision. Blinded by his love for money. Oh, we've heard this before. It's not that money's the root of all evil. It's what? The love of it. Drives people to do crazy things. Things that they thought they would never do. Blinded by his love for money, the king not only granted Haman his proposal, this awful, evil proposal, but he gave Haman his ring and the authority to carry it out. So basically what he's saying is, here's my ring, you do and you carry it out as you see fit. Now look what it says here in Esther 3:10 through 11. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Man, this story, if you're reading from the very beginning, this isn't looking good. Not looking good at all. Now, we've touched on this also, that once a king signed a law, it could not be altered or rescinded. This was known as the law of the Medes and the Persians, meaning that when a decree was given by the king and it was given by mouth and it was written, he couldn't take it back. It's not like he could just take his pencil and erase. Once it was given, it had to be carried out. It had to be fulfilled. So Haman saw the king's permission as a major victory. However, remember, God's still working behind the scenes, even though this looks pretty dark at the moment. In accepting the ring, Haman actually, he sealed his own doom by doing this. No king, potentate, nation, or confederation of nations can attack Israel without suffering the consequences. And Haman, we'll find that out as we talk about later in the story. Genesis 12:3, this is what was touched on a little bit earlier. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This is the covenant God has with the Jewish people. And to Haman's own detriment, he became who cursed Israel, and it would bring him down. Now let's read Esther 3:12 through 14. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for a command to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. Now, according to this new decree, on the 13th day of the month of Adar, the 12th month of the year, all the Jews in the entire empire were to be killed. Once the decree was signed by the king, it was copied by the scribes and sent with couriers throughout all 127 provinces of Persia. Now, you can only imagine, this leads us to the next thing, the confusion, the city's confusion. Now, there isn't any type of record on how everyone responded throughout the entire kingdom when this took place. But in Shushan itself, we see the city descend into confusion. Look what it says here in verse 15. The posts went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city, Shushan, was perplexed. What does perplexed mean? Confused, puzzled. What's going on here? I mean, why such a vast, just a awful, horrific command, this decree? But as all this is going on, the king and Haman have buddied up, big buddies, celebrated the decree, perhaps even maybe getting drunk in celebrating a victory. However, while they celebrated, panic, like questions being asked, possibly people going to each other saying, I know some Jewish people and they're really, what did they do? And many questions like this may have been asked. What was the purpose? John G. Butler, once again, this is another quote, said, while the king and Haman drank, the city was distressed. After all, if one race of people can be wiped out by a decree of the king, what about other races? Governments that are evil do not produce tranquility to their people. Rather, they produce troubling hearts and minds. So it's very possible that non-Jewish people were thinking, okay, could it happen to us? Like, what type of decree is this? But Haman thought he had won, but we know God had a plan to save His people. Let's look at number 3, and this is a plan for salvation. Now, Mordecai's grief. Mordecai found out about this. He found out what happened, the anger, the decree had been given. And what did he do? Verses 1 through 2, chapter 2. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Now, Mordecai's mourning. I believe in this moment he cried the hardest cry that he had probably ever cried, because he knew maybe this was a result of him not bowing. It possibly crossed his mind. It also crossed his mind knowing that this was a Persian command, a decree, knowing it could not be reversed. And he felt upon himself that this was going to be the end of the Jewish race, the Jewish people. So he put on sackcloth, and this was a common practice of grief during that day, and ashes, and he wept, and he cried. I've had moments in my life where I've just cried, curled up in a ball. I don't know if you've had those moments or not. I remember going through with my mom when she passed away, and it was a very difficult year, and there would be times I was young, and I would just at bed at night, remember helping my dad get my mom from the bed to, she had a little porta potty there next to the bed because she had brain surgery. And after moving my mom, I remember going back to bed and I'd just lay there and I'd probably cry for like an hour because I didn't want to see my mom like that, and I could tell she didn't want me to see her like that. And it was just a time of mourning and crying. And we've all had those moments where we have just literally cried until we just don't have any more tears. We've mourned so much. But here we see not only was Mordecai mourning, but rightly so, the Jews of the empire were mourning. Mordecai was not alone. Look what it says here in verse number 3. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, you ever heard wailing before? There's a difference between crying and wailing. I've heard people wail before, and it's just almost like it makes the hair stand up on your neck. And literally, it's just in a moment where they just, I don't know how to explain it. It's just quite different. And I can imagine that during this time, just the wailing, because you got to think, these people and their families, there's been this decree, and thinking my family, our fate could be soon decided. And that would have been a very hard thing to do, and they were mourning with this. But then also, not only the Jews of the empire mourning, but Mordecai's communication. Through all this, Mordecai did not lose hope in God, even in the midst of this grief. And it was hard. It's easy. It's one thing to say that you believe God's going to bring you through, and there's another thing of actually like walking and acting like it. Okay, because we can say this all that we want. But even though we know God is going to bring us through, and oftentimes with illness, we see that sometimes people survive, sometimes they don't. And but whether or not they survive or they don't, if they're healed here, miraculously. But if they know and they've trusted in Jesus, they're going to get healed regardless. And so we see within this that Mordecai did not lose hope in God. And apparently, Esther was unaware of the decree. With her being the queen, this is kind of odd because it almost leads me to believe that either Esther was distanced by the king and wasn't a part of his decisions, which was very possible, or there was just some type of division between them. We don't quite know, but all we know is that Esther was unaware of the decree. So when she learned that Mordecai was grieving in sackcloth and ashes in the streets, she was grieved because this is the man that was her cousin and had adopted her and became her adopted father, had raised her. And she is weeping with him. Look what it says here in verse 4 through 5. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen extremely grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Esther wanted to speak to her adopted father, and Mordecai could not come in because it would not be permitted in the palace for him to come in sackcloth and ashes. So here's Mordecai's reply. This is verses 6 through 9. We'll read this. So Hatak went forth to Mordecai into the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasurers for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. Now, Mordecai lays it out. And this messenger, Hatak, he tells him everything, or tells the chamberlain everything. And what does he say? He asks Esther to go before the king. And she responds back That it was out of the question for her to go to the king unless she was called for. Now, why is that? No one could go to the king unless they were summoned. To go to the king unannounced, surprise the king, was immediately 100% probably death. So look what it says here in verse 10 through 12. Again, Esther spake unto Hatach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out of the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Now, this was a pretty big deal. He wasn't asking Esther just to do some little simple favor. This was an important thing. Up to this point, he was asking her to do the most important thing that she's ever done in her life. Because going before the king unannounced to do this, she was putting her life on the line. She was basically risking everything to go to the king. So Mordecai's understanding. Mordecai understood Esther's predicament. He had to. He had to know what would happen. I mean, he's asking her. He knew what could happen. However, in his reply, he reminded her of 3 issues, and we see those here in verses 13 through 14. Look at this. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlarge and in deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? 3 things. First of all, Esther living in the palace was not a guarantee that she would be exempt from this execution. Okay? Because if she is a Jew, Haman's going to get mad. All right? Now, maybe he knew, maybe he didn't do. I don't know. Maybe later on it would have come out, but there was no way for her to be exempt from this. Also, number 2, if she kept silent, God, though not mentioned by name in verse number 14, but it's very obvious that this is a verse related to the presence and sovereignty of God, would bring deliverance from another place in the kingdom. Just like with us today, if you don't honor and you don't follow what God has called you to do, if you just harden your heart and say no, God will find somebody else to do it. He will find someone to be used for His glory. Number 3 is Mordecai told Esther that perhaps this was the whole reason she was in the palace. For such a time as this. Now, there's a story. God in His sovereignty can use anything or anyone He wants to accomplish. Listen to this little story here. I thought it was unique. And remember this past Sunday I was talking about the small things, about the spider? Well, I'm on a roll. I'm going to use another bug here, okay? So, Victoria of England was once on a British express train in the middle of the night. True story. On this dark night, the engineer suddenly saw something in the middle of the tracks that looked almost like a phantom. As a ghost. Thought he saw a ghost. This, of course, caused the engineer to stop the train. He saw this, it scared him so bad, he had to stop and get out and investigate. When the crewmen stepped outside to find their phantom, they did not immediately see him, but what they saw instead was far more frightening. As they stared into the fog, that foggy night, they realized that a bridge had collapsed and fallen into the water. The entire train had almost sunk. But what was the phantom that he thought he saw? It was merely just a moth that looked bigger than what it was. But to Queen Victoria, that moth was an agent sent by God. She believed that the moth was sent by God for such a time as that to protect them that night. They would have all died. Now, let's look at Esther's faith here. When Esther heard Mordecai's message, she knew what she needed to do. Verses 15 through 17. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye from me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. Also my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him to do. Now, Esther showed her faith in 2 ways here. Number 1, faith to fast. Not only did she fast, but she requested that all the Jews in Shushan as well as her maidens fast with her for 3 days. Now, I don't know if you've ever fasted before or in prayer for something. It's a very just humbling experience if you've ever done that and something's been deep on your heart and through your mind. But also, number 2 is a faith to die. So I will go unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. She was ready to meet her death, if that's what it called for. Bible translator William Tyndale had a similar faith of courage. After his English translation of the Bible spread throughout England, King Henry VIII, Sir Thomas More, and Bishop John Stokesley all wanted him dead. William Tyndale was eventually betrayed, however, by a supposed friend and sentenced to be burned at the stake. You know what his last words were? And this is while he was dying, as he was burning. His final prayer was this: Father, open the eyes of the king. And sometimes the cost of obedience is our life, and Esther didn't know whether she would live or die. She didn't know what the end result would be, but she knew what she had to do. She knew she had to be the person that went, and we can see God's finger here on this story and how all this is transpiring. However, she did know the Lord wanted her to obey Him regardless of the outcome. And then isn't that also what we're required to do? Required to do is to live a life of faith, taking a step of obedience even when we don't know what the result may be. This will be the last verse that we read here. This is 2 Corinthians 5, 6-8. Therefore, we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, we are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Now, something important here. There's people who have had their lives taken and have stood up for the Lord. If you remember, I was in high school in 1999 when the Columbine shootings happened, and there was 2 girls, if I can remember their names, Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott, I believe. They were 2 girls that had books written after them about when the shooters in the school had their guns pointed at them. They asked them if they believed in God, and they both said yes, and as soon as they did, they were assassinated, they were killed. And so, oftentimes, a life can be asked and required. Is that going to happen to everybody? No. Is it going to happen to some? Very likely. And the thing is that we're just called to live a life and walk in faith. And I believe in this moment, Esther knew the risk. She knew what could happen, but she knew regardless of what happened, she was going to honor God. And this is very obvious through the end of this here in chapter number 4 and what she was going to do. Any questions? We'll stop there for tonight. Anything that kind of caught your attention? I still just amazed. Where did Haman get this money? I mean, he must have went to the casino or something and won it all. I mean, that's a lot of money to offer. Um, yes, a lot. Yeah, yeah, probably. I mean, maybe the Amalekites. Remember, we talked about the how that King Xerxes got his money was from conquering. Maybe, very likely, over time he'd have accumulated that, but that's a lot to accumulate. That's one question I've got as I think about this story is, where did this come from? I mean, $4 billion would be the equivalent today, and $4 billion. I'll never see that in my bank account. It'd be nice if I woke up morning and saw $4 billion, but I mean, that's a lot to offer. And King King Xerxes was just a willing subject that was weak financially, and he accepted it. Gave him his ring, gave him everything he wanted. So it's just sad today to see and to know. Speaking about politics, I don't really talk about politics a lot, but to know that oftentimes money will get people to do stuff, even when it's not right. And so we've seen that in the history of our own country. So something to consider there, look at, part of the story. Hamas, yeah, 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 yeah. I just can't imagine hating someone so much, though, that I want to eliminate their whole race. That, to me, just, yeah, yeah, yeah. I can't even, with my little finite thinking, I can't even comprehend that type of hate. I mean, that would be such a evil hate. Um, yeah, 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 yeah. That's right. Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts on this? All right. Well, thank y'all for being attentive. Hopefully, you're enjoying this. It's if not, it's not a long study. It's not a long book, but hopefully you have. And I think it's neat to kind of pull these things out and look at those, especially like the financial aspect. Looking at what it would be in today's standards. I mean, that's pretty significant. So the king he couldn't just pass that up. Um, he took it, hook, bait. He took the whole thing. Yeah. All right, appreciate y'all, and be praying for this Sunday. Robert will be here, and we'll be away, and I'll be back next Wednesday. But also pray for our trunk or treat, be Tuesday night, as we minister to the community, have the kids come. So hopefully everybody can come and help in some way. But if not, if you can't come, just pray for us. Pray we have a safe night next Tuesday night. All right. Okay. Let's go ahead and stand, and we'll pray together. Father, we love you. Thank you for this opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you for this study. Thank you for the opportunity to look deeper into Scripture and just find some historical nuggets that are there, and just look at the context of the story and look at things today that are going on that are like mirror images of things that were going on within this biblical text. And Father, we just thank you so much for this privilege to do that. And we pray for safety as we travel home. And we love you and thank you so much for Jesus. We ask all this in His name. Amen. Amen.